The first one is actually when we started, that each member country tried to bring back its own citizens home. It was an activity which normally you wouldn't do. Bring all your citizens back to your own country. We did this again on the national level, and partly there was some support, late support of the European Commission. Then the next example is we had 2 weeks of export bans by countries like Germany and France, what concerns safety equipment, medical equipment. Then you remember all the border closures and the border restrictions. And there was no coordination of border controls and border closures between member states and also with third countries. The coordination started only bilaterally, for instance, between Germany, Austria, Hungary, and sometimes trilaterally, including also a country like Romania, for instance. And maybe even more basic is the idea that the public health policies measures that have been introduced by our member countries are very different. And they are not only very different at the beginning, when it was not clear, and again, I remind you of the situation that some countries thought we have to make sure that the wave of infections is not getting too high, out of control for our health system. And other countries officially or almost officially said, no, actually, we have to get a situation where the majority of the population has already had this disease, and then we will be safe. And until nowadays, a country like Sweden is having a different public health policy from most of the other EU countries. And this is even true for now the lessening of the EU restrictions. Even now, how to relax the containment between the member countries of the European Union is seen in different ways. As you know, in Austria, in my country, we start with small shops, and only later on with schools and later on with public events. But a country like Denmark, for instance, started this week with primary schools and kindergarten and not with the shops. So the public health policy measures, because in the European Union, health is a national competence, has been very difficult to coordinate. And now, maybe even more important when the crisis will be over, what about the economic policy measures within the European Union? And there we saw from the very beginning that very different strategies how to help the workers and the employers in this crisis. And it was only later on that the European Commission started to help with more flexibility in the regulations, and now with the discussion of how much can be used from the European Stability Mechanism, and the idea that we have more than 500 billion now, which is reserved on this, and the Commission proposing, and actually today and tomorrow, the Parliament will decide that also some money from the budget 2020 of the European Union will be used for help measures within the European Union countries. So you could say at the beginning, it was very clear that in a time of crisis, we are thrown back to the nation state, and it's not the European Union which can help in such a fundamental crisis. But there is also a different story about the European Union, how it's reacting. And this story is, we all know the European Union is a slow creature, but it's consistent. Over time, it can help and it can make its way to coordinate things. And I would love to follow the second story, that there is a chance also for the European Union. And there is some problem when you want to see the EU role in a positive way. Only yesterday, the president of the EU Commission announced a roadmap how the member countries should lift restrictions of public life. And even there, when you read the text of this roadmap, you find very carefully phrased statements like the member countries should notify each other and the Commission in due time before they announce lifting measures and take into account their views. What does this mean? It actually means there is no power of the European Commission to coordinate how the member countries lift the restrictive measures. They can only use phrases like they should notify in due time, they should take into account the views of others. And as far as I know so far, the account of others about coordinating the lifting of measures is, frankly speaking, limited. So one could say there was little preparedness and little resilience of the European Commission and the Union as a whole. Maybe, and now we should discuss this actually, one could say in this time of crisis, the European Union instruments were dysfunctional. Before I open the floor for questions and answers, let me just remind you that it's not the first time that we feel that in a time of crisis, we do have a real problem of common European initiatives. It started with the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, then the Greek default crisis, where it was very difficult to find a common position. And then the refugee crisis of 2015 was a similar case. And actually the only crisis where it seemed to be that the 27 can hold together was the Brexit situation, where the 27 had a common position regarding how to deal with the United Kingdom and the question of leaving the European Union. So where are we really? Is it the fault of the structure that we have in the European Union that in fundamental issues like public health or an economic crisis, the nation state is the, as I said, is the actor of last resort? And maybe the last point, quite a few people say that what's going on here in the European Union is also a human rights crisis because of the fact that we are not sure what the reactions of the restrictions of the liberty of citizens is proportionate and what it is reasonable. There is no clear legal formulation of what it means to have reasonable and proportionate restrictions. And you know, some of countries in the European Union are criticized for using this unclear definition in a very wide way, and it might be the case that already existing tendencies of differences between West and Eastern European Union may be increased by all this. So here I stop actually, and I hope that we can now open the floor for discussions to see whether my quite realistic point of view and of how the European Union as a whole has been acting so far is right, and whether there is a real chance that with more time given for developing the common policies will come to a more coordinated approach towards acting the European Union, because otherwise you will see that our tourists, but also our business people, will ask for opening of borders and for international travel in a coordinated way. And it doesn't look possible to have this sort of opening of the borders of one member country without taking into account the health situation in other member countries. So that's where I stop, and I would like you, I hope my co-host is hearing me, and I would like to open the floor for the first one who has a question.
Please, Mr. Koch, it's your turn. Hello, this is Herbert Koch from Vienna.
Hello, Herbert.
Hello, Servus, Emil. Thank you very much for this comprehensive initial remarks. And obviously, it's striking to see the European Union in such a weak position. And obviously, it's not commonly known that actually in this very important measures of public health, the European Union does not have any say. And yet, everything else that goes hand in hand with just reinforces the picture that one might get of the European Union. There is a new commission which is barely familiar, has barely had the opportunity to familiarize itself with the portfolios, is being challenged on a big scale. And not only that they have no authority, they don't even have to have major thoughts on what to do. There are no enunciations from the Commission in terms of what could or should be done by the respective member states. So my question would be, why this, even if you have no authority by law, but there is no restriction on authority of thoughts, why do you think that this has not been taken up?
Well, actually, you're absolutely right that the new commission had hoped to be a geopolitical commission with a Green Deal as its basic first big project, and the crisis came. That's not unusual for the European Union. We very often had new commissions which thought that they have ideas, and then the crisis came on. Why it's for the Commission so difficult is actually easy to say. First of all, as you said, there is only a national competence for public health. What the European Union did together actually was to have a center for preparing resilience in cases of pandemics, but this center actually is only trying to coordinate data, which is important, but it's not for policymaking. So the Commission would be the one to propose policies how to overcome this. But actually, as we know, the power triangle between Commission, the European Council and the Parliament has been shifted in the last few years towards the European Council. That means towards the individual member states. And the member states at the moment are most interested what happens to their own citizens. And that is understandable because the citizens expect from their own government to react and to find a solution to the problem. A normal European citizen at the moment does not ask for a European solution at the moment. For his worries, for his fears, for his health issues, he asks that the national health system helps him. The more difficult time will come when people see the consequences as far as the economy is concerned. Then even the individual citizen in Austria will ask for, what is Europe doing? What is the European Union doing? And that's why I think the second part of our situation will be sort of challenge for the European Commission really to come forward with better ideas than just to say we can have a Green Deal and a crisis deal altogether, or saying that this is a moment where you can prove that the multi-annual budget for the coming years needs to be bigger than we had discussed in the last few months. I don't think that these are already the solutions to the problem that we have. And if you ask me personally, I also am quite afraid of the pressure of Eurobonds or Corona bonds, because it is true that once you introduce this idea that you really transfer big amounts of money from the north to the south, you will never take it away again. It will be either you don't take it away or you break up the whole construction of the European Union. So I would be very hesitant to make such a proposal. But it's now actually for the European institutions to come up with these sort of ideas for the future and to gain back the power of argument. The power of argument is not with the Commission. They are really still too late and too little. And I give one more example on the question of how can we save our European airlines. You would say, like the Americans, the US is doing now, it needs a common approach for all the airlines you have. In the United States, I think the new package that the administration announced is for all American airlines. There are 37 or something. In the European case, the Commission is slowly trying to coordinate and allowing states that they can step in to give money to save the national airlines. But I don't see the coordination. It is still, the aid is discussed in national terms. Again, the Austrian example. We had in Austrian media a discussion about how Austrian airlines can be saved. And suddenly the sum of 800 million euro turned up in the media. I don't know where it came from, but it's again the idea that the nation state has a responsibility for saving the national carrier, which, as we know, is not a national carrier in the traditional sense of the word. And similar discussions are coming up in Germany and also in other European countries. So we are in a situation where we see that fundamental issues of the European future at the moment are hard to coordinate by the Commission. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, there are more questions to come, but I don't want to. I would like to listen to others as well, and maybe at the end we could take some of the other questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Who is the next question, please? Raise your hands and we can unmute you. Okay. Mr. Patrick Müller, please.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, Ambassador Brix. I would be quite interested in hearing your views on how harmonized a coordinated European response to the health crisis should be, because of course one could also make the counter argument that diverging or differing national responses maybe allow us to learn from best practices in the various countries. As we know, Sweden does very different things than other countries, and we have still very little data on how certain measures then affect health relevant outcomes. So different countries trying different things could also allow us to see what actually works, what is necessary, and what are probably also unnecessary constraints on the economy with very little health benefits.
Yes, Patrick, thank you for the question. I think it is dangerous to follow this line of thought because it simply means that let's try different strategies and we know then for the next pandemic or for the next crisis. We are in the middle of this situation and we have a lot of data which give us some inclination how to act. So I don't think it's a question of finding the right policies or how we should act on restraining liberties or on relaxing the constraints that we have. It's a question of politics, really. It is what is needed is actually the political will to coordinate. And this is not something that I'm claiming that the Commission has the power to do. I'm just saying that in such a time where you have to find solutions in a European context in a short time, we don't have the instruments to do this, and we are falling back on the member state, on the nation state. I agree, it's the first time we have to do this, and there is the chance that by using different strategies, we will learn for the future. But I think we could have done better in finding common approaches. I don't really understand why it's so difficult to discuss between Sweden and other member countries what's so good about their strategy of doing this sort of social distancing without any obligation, but just by the mentality of the people who are disciplined. And this may actually lead to the question, how much is the mentality of our national cultures in the European Union different? And these sort of issues are, I think, issues that after the crisis we may discuss, but right now I don't think that having these sort of different approaches to the crisis are very helpful.
Mr. Simic from the University of Graz, I see you have written in the chat that you have several questions to Ambassador Brix. Could you perhaps raise your question now?
Yeah, hello, hi. Thank you, Ambassador Brix, for your input, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Danko Simic, and I'm working at the University of Graz, dealing with Europeanization processes in the southeast of Europe. And I was wondering, how do we deal with member countries like, for example, Slovenia or Hungary, that at the moment are uninstalling or violating basic mechanism and structures of democracy on the one hand. And another question that I would like to add is, how do we deal with, for example, the current situation at the Greek-Turkish border? How do we put the focus of the European Union again, and don't forget about the things that are going on besides the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, the COVID-19, thank you for the question again. The COVID-19 crisis is somehow pushing away all the other issues which are not away, I have to say. And to a certain extent, they are intensifying issues that we already had, like the situation whether Hungary is following the rules that we have in the European Union on rule of law or not. And one could even say that there is this danger that in the crisis, because the attention is on the crisis, some governments or some politicians may use it for purposes which has nothing to do with the crisis. That is quite obvious. So I have to say, if you have a state of emergency without limitation, this is not something that in the European Union we should accept. And this we have to tell the country and its leaders that we have principle. We need also for this sort of argumentation sunset clauses. We need a reaffirmation of parliament in regular times and so on. So this has nothing to do with the COVID crisis actually, but with rule of law in the European Union. And I think it's worth looking already now into how the member countries make use of their conviction what rule of law means and how they use states of emergency or constraints or reducing of liberties. But it is difficult because just look at the question of whether the tracking by smartphones should be allowed, whether it should be used on a voluntary basis or whether it should become obligatory. Even there are different opinions in member countries of the European Union, whether this contravenes our ideas of privacy laws or not. And again, the Commission, when you read the roadmap that they produced yesterday, is wishy-washy, at least. Because what it says, yes, it might be good that you do it, but it's up to the member countries, and there is this idea, and if you do it, you have to do it under regulations of privacy laws and so on. But it's not giving a real advice. The same is true actually for using the masks in everyday life for ordinary people. But your second question on Southeastern Europe, I would like to say a few words because there is a real problem. When the crisis started, countries like Serbia got the idea that they are not helped by member countries of the European Union. And the example, which was very simple, it was, I think, the president of the commissioner said, we should not allow to export medical equipment to non-EU member countries. And it never came true, but it was obviously said, and the president of Serbia used it immediately to ask the Chinese for help. And the Chinese immediately sent a plane with all sort of medical equipment, and this was congratulated by Vucic and so on and so on. What did the European Union do? In this case, the Commission realized very fast, and the member countries, that this is a real challenge, because as we know, we have a lot of geopolitical problems in the region, where the Chinese and the Americans and the Russians are interfering into our European area. And so the Commission, in a fast way, organized support money for medical equipment for the Western Balkan countries. Not a big amount, but actually it was a good reaction by the European Commission to say that we are helping in this situation also those countries which want to join the European Union. So, and the second point where I think the EU reacted in a positive way is that even although the crisis was already started, the decision was taken by the European Council that the negotiations for entry of North Macedonia and Albania can be started. This was a positive surprise, actually, of how we can act together in such a situation. And my feeling is that if we really want to create stability in the region and improve the situation of democracy, we have to send out more of these positive ideas towards the Western Balkan countries than we did in the last few months, I would say. And as you know, Austria is certainly an advocate of doing this exactly, but within the 27 countries, it's not always that easy.
Thanks a lot. Can I just also ask you to shortly comment on what is going on the Greek-Turkish border and how to deal with the migration crisis, as you mentioned, 2015, and that we might learn something from it?
Yes, well, actually, the Commission tried to learn, because there is a commission now responsible for migration issues, and von der Leyen has commissioned him that he should prepare migration paper or migration pacts of the European Union. And the idea was that it should be already presented in March. But because of actually, first of all, because of the situation at the Greek-Turkish border, and secondly now because of the COVID crisis, this report is still not known. I hope that this does not mean that there is not enough courage in the European Commission to prepare such a report. But the tricky thing about it is certainly that between member countries we have different opinions of how to deal with this issue, and different national approaches how to deal with it. I don't see a situation where the idea that you can distribute migrants not from the refugee camps on the Greek islands to all member countries. That's out of the question. But I appreciate that a few countries like Luxembourg, Germany, and hopefully others are taking minors from these refugee camps. But it's not a symbol. It's not a signal that we are getting closer to a solution which is accepted by all member countries. As you know, Turkey now has its own problem with the COVID-19 situation, especially in the big cities. And I guess we won a little bit of time in this crisis, but it's not gone away, and it will be very soon back on the radar of all participants. And as I said, at the moment, I don't see a common European position on this.
Thanks a lot.
Pleasure.
Andre, you have raised some questions in the chat. It's now your floor, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you for, finding the time to be with us. Well, my question actually expands on some of the topics you already addressed. How do you see, the situation in the European Union moving forward and the tensions between European Union supporters, European Union skeptics? Because I think this crisis of COVID is a turning point, and I think you mentioned that this actually made it very evident what some of the problems are. One of the questions that I'm particularly interested in is this situation we have in countries like Italy that, the population, not only politicians, say, oh, we need more support from the European Union. And of course, some other countries say, wait a minute, you guys have to be more responsible and accountable for your economic decisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, if these countries take a hard line, you're basically opening or paving the way for, let's say, maybe more populist regimes to say, oh, why do we need the European Union if they can't help us? I think this is very complicated. And then at the same time, you're opening a door for other countries outside the European Union. And I'm thinking about China. Then you just gave us an example of what happened. But China, we know, also helped Italy at a critical juncture. So they also, of course, geopolitically use this as an opportunity to increase their let's say, influence within the European Union. So how do you see this moving forward?
Yes,
Thank you.
I think the basic idea of the new commission to try to be a geopolitical power is a right one, because we have to see where are the strengths of the European Union, which we're not using so far. The strengths are basically our power in trade and actually also our power in standard making. So this if we can continue on these strengths, that would be very helpful. Where I see the real problem is asking for solidarity in these sort of basic things. This will be one of the decisive moments whether, let's be frank, like whether Germany will be ready to open up this Pandora's box, which so far the feeling is if you do that, you create anti-European feeling in Germany itself, which you cannot control. The idea that AfD will use it for political purposes is not unrealistic, we have to say. But you could at the same time say the same is true in Italy. If you don't support with common money the Italian economic crisis, then you open up for populist party successes in Italy. So there is a bigger divide coming. As I see it, at the moment, we don't have an answer to this. But, you know, in the European Union, normally when we have such a crisis, we don't invent everything new, but we try to work incrementally, as it says, incrementally with small steps where we can further have common tools that we can develop. But it is very difficult because if you have the fundamental decision at the moment, Eurobonds, yes or no, there is no compromise is hard to find. As you know, the decisions and the discussions between the finance ministers and also next week with the heads of states and government is all about this. Can we find a way which is a compromise between the North and the South at the moment about how we provide the necessary money, liquidity, and also what we need for the coming crisis. I guess some conditionality will be put on the money that is provided by the European Union. I would say Italy will have to accept some sort of conditionality, and maybe other countries, if they accept the money. I know that as far as the European Stability Mechanism is concerned, Italy said, no, we don't want to use it because there are strings attached. There is conditionality to a certain extent, but I don't see a situation where the EU27 will agree for Eurobonds without some conditionality on the economic policy in the member countries.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Mrs. Alamora, it's your turn, please, now.
Yes, thank you. My name is Maddalena, and I'm also DA alumni. I'm working at the OEC mission to Serbia, and my question stems from your comments on the country and how it's turning to China and other actors which are not the European Commission. working for an international organization on the ground, my question would be, how do you see organizations such as the UN or the OSCE filling in the gaps basically left by the European Commission in countries of the Western Balkans? And in particular, which kind of aids you think could be of priorities? Because we are currently looking into it, and I'd really appreciate your take on it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think there are organizations which can be very helpful in such a situation because, let's say it like this, they're not political. Immediately when you talk about Chinese influence, Russian influence, American influence, you're talking about geopolitics. But if organizations like the OSCE and other organizations on the ground are active, it is helpful. There is one actor you didn't mention, that's the United States of America. And as you know, they are very active on the ground. And what would be very helpful is to bring them back in a better coordination with the European Union and the Commission working in the Balkans. And the question of, for instance, of the political situation in Kosovo at the moment is a good example of how difficult that is, because what I hear from European diplomats is that they were not informed about how the Americans would act in their relations with the Prime Minister and the President in Kosovo, and with all the following consequences. So I think OSCE and other organizations which do not act as geopolitical actors in the sense of power relations are very helpful at the moment on the ground. But even more than that, I'm hopeful that the European Union with its instruments will understand that especially the situation of this crisis demands also some future projects where the European Union as an idea can gain impetus again. And I think the integration of the Western Balkans would be a very good cause and very obvious cause for showing that we together as 27 can achieve something.
Thank you.
It's again Herbert Kort from Vienna, and for all the others, I'd like to point out that I'm the chairman of a company which is certainly a global leader in refractories, and we have operations. We're world market leader from China to Chile, from Brazil to India, North America, and Turkey. But my question, of course, is concerned with what, I don't know whether it's a question, it's a rather remark. The only thing we know right now is that we are in a deep recession. The question is how deep the recession is. You get 10 answers and everybody may be right. We talk about the future, which is uncertain. The next question is, can we avoid, or is it that there will be a depression following this recession? And obviously here, it would be worthwhile looking into history in terms of what can history teach us, if at all. And if we look at the Great Depression in the United States 90 years ago, probably we can take some consolation that this might not be the case for various reasons, but not least for one reason that has been, how should I say, that has been a mitigating factor, certainly then. These budget deficits that have been vilified or mesmerized by one or the other side, that 60% of net of the GDP must not be, the deficit must not be higher. This is obviously ludicrous. And now we see with this crisis, everybody is going above and beyond. And there are good reasons for that. Now the United States already, for all the other mistakes it may or may not have done, Trump has announced a program of $2.5 trillion to invigorate the infrastructure to an extent which is 10 to 15% of GDP, and more is to come. Now, we, Ambassador, you have talked about these corona bonds, and Austria should not, and there must be conditionality. And I could hear that you are basically supporting the restrictive ideas of our government, which I find is a bit difficult to understand, because if we, at the end of the day, who should buy our products if not the Italians, the Spaniards, and the others? So it seems to me, what is the answer of the European Union to the aftermath of the crisis to avoid a depression? And if we learn from America, maybe we can learn that. If we look at Japan, we can also learn that having deficits or having debts in the extent of 250% of GDP is not really that devastating that everybody has been predicting, certainly ever since 2008. So I'm wondering how you take this, Emil.
Herbert, this is a challenging question. Actually, I'm following the line of the Austrian government here, and I have to say I think it's a life or death issue for the future of the European Union. And I'm not sure, I fully agree that the debt level is not important at the moment. So if national governments, and this is already allowed now at the moment, have higher debts, national debts, that should be really possible for some longer time. It will be necessary. But I don't think that these sort of debts then have to be guaranteed by all the member countries. So I think that it is not the solution to say, actually, we don't coordinate our economic policies or financial policies, but we coordinate the debts and we divide them between all of us. If we really would like to go ahead on this, we need a full economic and political union. And as we all know, we don't have majorities in Europe now who are ready for a common European state, which it would mean actually. I see, and I'm here only analyzing it, I'm not saying whether I like it or not, I see that the idea that in basic functions, the state, the nation are sovereign, is returning in many fields. It's not only the health issue here, but it's also on economic issues. It's on some sort of controlling the borders, which is very difficult, as we all know. But just think about the idea that we all feel that now medical equipment has to be produced in all our countries, so we don't have to import it. That's already some sort of trade restriction that we are discussing, and this will come. Or like the Americans are doing it for quite some time, as the Trump administration is saying, these are all national interests, and that's why we need to produce them at home, or to at least have tariffs on if other countries are doing it. So this will actually increase. So I don't think that this is a time where we get better chances for a totally free trade area around the globe, but rather a time where we have to make sure that our nation states can manage economically the crisis. And how deep it will be, you name the number of economists and you get the number of answers you get for this.
You know, this is very interesting. Just one comment to that, Emil. That is, obviously, what can we learn from that crisis? One thing is the value chains of the global economies will be changed to a more regional ones, and obviously with more buffer stocks. And so this reliance on China and on India to supply everything for everybody is, I think this is history. Number two, what we learn, and you are now actually a very good example, Mr. Ambassador, that digitization will take over from and all many forms of communication, and life will be changed dramatically by that. And thirdly, and this is where I wanted to come, is that the strong companies will better survive than the weak ones. It is no, but so we've got to do something about it as well. And I think, as we say in German, Not kein Gebot. If in a time of crisis, there are there are different rules, so to speak. I think maybe this is also something that the Austrian Foreign Ministry and the Austrian body politics can advocate. We have seen yesterday in the Financial Times that Madame Vestager has said, well, in order not to encourage unwanted bids for European companies that are in difficulties because of COVID-19, some of the rules, competition rules, should be disregarded, and the nation states may be allowed to step in at interim.
Yes.
Maybe I could add a point to that, and to basically advocate a more market-oriented approach. Yes, let's agree that some of these stiff rules should be mitigated, should be loosened, but we would like to avoid Chinese takeovers or non-European takeovers of European companies. But in case there is a European competitor who could take up and take a participation in one of these companies, then the competition rules should be loosened and not have a government state-owned enterprise make it out. So basically, I'm not arguing for nationalization in case there is a European competitor who could do it much better and strengthen Europe against the non-European companies.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. This is a little bit beyond the scope of a diplomat, what you're discussing now. But I fully agree. The political discussion is now how can we avoid that in our debt crisis and economic crisis, foreign powers take over our companies. My first point is, well, actually, what about the economic crisis in other parts of the world? Are they also afraid of our takeovers of Chinese companies? I haven't heard so much about that. So there seems to be a lack of confidence in big European companies, which is quite strange.
Well, it's, you cannot buy, if you want in China, you cannot buy what you want. You only can so it's basically, it's a move geared at the Chinese unfair competition.
Yes, but we also have discussed, does it only mean China is an unfair competitor, or does it include the United States of America, for instance? That is, to me, it's not clear whether this is the case.
Yeah, fair point, yes.
But that's because you asked what can we learn from the crisis. That's one of the major points, that intervention into the market system in times of crisis is necessary, is unavoidable. And again, I fully agree with your point. The intervention should be as much a non-state direct intervention as possible. But it looks very likely that at the moment, all the states have to come in. Just think about the reactions in all our member countries that they immediately promised big sacks of money, big amounts of money to rescue the workplace and to rescue small and medium companies especially, but also the industry. So the moment you have the crisis, the moment your own country is at risk. So you have the feeling my home is my castle is at the moment still very much the idea. And politically, I think that's quite understandable. And I would say if the European Commissioner, Vestager and others are now trying to think how within the European Union we come up with solutions which do not dismantle totally the market economy, but which help us to keep basic wheels of decision-making in the economy in Europe, very necessary and actually very good. We don't know yet what these instruments will look like. As you know, also in Austria, we will have a law concerning this problem. I think next week or in 2 weeks' time already it will come. My general feeling is that I would be less afraid of these sort of things, but I'm not an economist, so that's just my gut feeling as someone looking at the situation.